This is a response to a comment on a popular video we put out interviewing David Wood, an apologist known for addressing Islam. In this video, David explains that Muslims are faced with a severe dilemma that he believes proves Islam to be false. On the one hand, the Quran affirms the inspiration, authority, and preservation of the New Testament Gospels. But on the other hand, the New Testament Gospels teach against important doctrines taught by the Quran. So, if the New Testament Gospels are wrong, the Quran is wrong. But if the New Testament Gospels are true, the Quran is wrong. Either way, Islam is in trouble. Now, someone wrote a comment on our video in response to David Wood, presumably a Muslim apologist, and that's what we're going to analyze today. By looking at this comment, I think we have a nice opportunity to understand both the Muslim and the Christian perspective a little more. The comment begins by saying, "What is called the Bible, both the Old and New Testaments, are not the actual books revealed by Allah to the prophets of Israel and to Jesus. These books have been altered and corrupted intentionally through scribal errors, mistranslations, misinterpretations, or even deliberate changes to accommodate theological preferences." The person goes on to talk about the Injil being corrupted. If you don't know, according to the Islamic faith, the Injil is a writing that once existed, containing the divinely revealed revelation from God to Jesus. Either way, the person is saying the Jesus writings, call it what you will, are corrupt. As Christian advocates for the story of God's love, we might be tempted to go at it and defend the preservation of the Gospels, a task we are well equipped to do. But remember, we are talking about the Islamic dilemma. So if we just go along with the person's argument, it sounds like they are admitting that the Quran got it wrong about the preservation of the Jesus writings, which would be to fall on one of the two swords that David Wood presented. The Islamic dilemma served its purpose. Or maybe something else is going on. As I've chewed over this comment for a while, I wonder if maybe the person is trying to say that when the Quran affirms the Jesus writings, the Gospels or the Injil, whatever, it affirms those writings as they originally came to be. So it's talking about the pre-corrupted writings, not the currently corrupted writings. This would be to say that the Islamic dilemma confuses itself by talking about Christian writings from one era in premise 1 and Christian writings from a latter era in premise 2. The premises are all fine, but premise 1 and premise 2 are not talking about the same thing. Therefore, the argument is what you would say invalid. The flow of reasoning from the premises to the conclusion doesn't work. Here's where I struggle with their thinking. That response could work for some passages of the Quran, but certainly not all. In many places, the Quran is encouraging Christians to go to their scriptures because the writings they have of Jesus can be trusted. Those Christians who lived when the Quran first came to be didn't have the originals. They had what's been handed down to them, like us today. It would be absurd for the Quran to defend itself by encouraging people to read writings that no longer exist. It's like sitting in a court and appealing to evidence that nobody has. Good luck being taken seriously by the jury. So I just find no way out of the fact that if you're going to read the Quran seriously, without forcing a bad interpretation, or in their words, deliberate changes to accommodate theological preferences, you must say that when the Quran was received, Christians had writings of Jesus that were inspired, preserved, and authoritative, something the Quran was betting on to defend itself. So if you're going to honor the Quran as a Muslim, but you still want to say that the Christian Bible has been corrupted, you would have to say that the corruption happened after the time of the Quran. If you go that route, you've dodged a bullet of misinterpreting the Quran, but now you've run up against history. I mean, by the time the Quran was received in the early 600s, Christianity was already fully established as a religion. So ask yourself, what sort of story could you tell to explain the Jesus writings becoming corrupted after the early 600s, but not before? Think about that. You want to say somebody deliberately changed the Bible? How? You would have to handwrite literally thousands of copies of the Gospels with your intentional alterations and then sneak into the majority of churches and private Christian homes that owned copies of the Gospels across the Mediterranean, Europe, Asia, and Africa, thousands of Christians, and swap all these copies of their Bible out with your corrupted version. So to say that somebody intentionally changed it doesn't work. And even if that were physically possible, remember that the Muslims must argue that the corruption was significant enough to change important Christian doctrine. So these new corrupted Jesus writings, for example, started calling Jesus God for the first time, saying that he died on the cross and saying that he resurrected. Do you really think the Christians wouldn't notice such drastic changes from their own sacred text? I mean, that would be as jarring as if the Quran itself started saying those things one day. A better attempt at this, I think, is to propose that the corruption of the Jesus writings happened slowly, over time, by unintentional mistakes as manuscripts were being copied after 600 AD. But even still, you have problems. First, it seems odd that the Jesus writings were reliably preserved for the first 600 years and then suddenly started corrupting themselves after Christianity had long been established. If any corruption was to be had, I think it would be prior to the time of the Quran, not after. Second, we have plenty of evidence of Christians prior to 600 AD arguing for the deity of Christ, the resurrection, and other doctrines that go against the Quran. More than that, they're explicitly using their Jesus writings to make their point that Jesus is God, that he was crucified on the cross and that he resurrected and all that. Third, we have plenty of manuscripts written before 600 AD and many after 600 AD that talk about Jesus. Nowhere are you going to find a big shift from preservation to corruption at or after 600 AD. In fact, you look only at manuscripts prior to 600 AD, they all tell the same story of Jesus we have today. We are not guessing, we are not assuming, we are simply telling a matter of fact by using our eyes to look directly at the ancient manuscripts that exist today, written prior to 600 AD. So, to summarize, you can't avoid the Islamic dilemma by claiming the Jesus writings were correct when they were originally delivered, or saying they were correct at the time the Quran was supposedly given to Muhammad. You certainly can't avoid it by insisting on their corruption in general, since that would be to play into the dilemma itself. As far as I can tell, the Islamic faith continues to wrestle with the fact that either the Quran is right about the Jesus writings or it's wrong about the Jesus writings, and either way, it's wrong about something. And if I can be frank here, for the sake of the gospel and everyone watching, as someone who has read through the Quran entirely, I'll admit I was impressed by how the Quran uses the Old Testament to warn people about what happens when you fail to believe God's prophets. It's right. I mean, that is a major theme in the Old Testament. The implication from the Quran is that you should believe in the prophet Muhammad. But maybe it's time for Muslims to take notice of the other warnings in the Old Testament that, curiously, the Quran tends to avoid. Namely, what happens when people do believe false prophets? The comment says a few other things. I didn't focus on those details because, as you've seen, a lot of it is irrelevant to this particular issue of the Islamic dilemma. Even still, let me race through a few of these final points. The person said a lot of stuff that strongly implies the Bible has been changed. Here's what you need to understand. In order to know the Bible has been changed, you need to know two things: the way it once was and the way it now is. That's how we identify change for anything. But if you know the way it once was, then you can just use that. Insofar as we have observed changes in the Bible, Christians have always gone back to the original, and that is what we use in our modern Bible translations. Of course, a lot more needs to be said because there are differences in our manuscripts. So how do we know that it has not been changed? That's a better question. And my short answer is that the differences are not significant enough to worry about, and we have enough data in our earliest manuscripts to reconstruct what the original said with great accuracy. On my own personal YouTube channel called A Christian Perspective, I have several videos showing that to be the case. This may be surprising, but I actually think our manuscript situation is better off than the Quran's. Not that the manuscripts of the Quran are all bad, but the Muslims, they don't have those differences to compare with. We didn't destroy our differing manuscripts like they did when Othman's manuscript tradition of the Quran came to be standardized. Also, in this comment, the person uses John 17:3 to argue that the only true God is the Father. Christians affirm that. We also affirm that the only true God is the Son, like it says in John 1:18, and the only true God is the Holy Spirit. This, I think, is where Muslims typically take issue with Christianity, because they would say, how can you believe all three of those things at the same time? Well, we hold all these beliefs together because of the notion that God is one in one sense and three in a different sense. That's the Trinity, not one and three in the same kind of way. I mean, we don't call it a mystery because it's a contradiction. We call it a mystery because our minds will never be able to grasp the profound depth and beauty of how God's love is revealed in his Trinitarian nature, from glory to the cross and back to glory. Lastly, the person says that many of the authors of the New Testament books are unknown. I would disagree with that too. I mean, I can see where it comes from, but having read the perspectives, I find that this statement here is just really misleading, especially when it comes to the Gospels. Again, on my own channel, I have several videos of the authors of the New Testament. If you like what you saw here, I hope you take the opportunity to see what I have over there. If you do, then I'll see you in the next video.